Hello, this is the official podcast of the Chartered Institute of Library and Information Professionals in Scotland. We kicked off episode 1 of Scotland's advocacy story by outlining the funding landscape for Scottish libraries, most specifically for public libraries.
We began to interview representatives from the Save Aberdeen Libraries Campaign and also spoke to Mike Dailly, Principal Solicitor and Solicitor Advocate at Glasgow's Govan Law Centre. Both contributors illuminated and spoke to the challenges faced by library advocates and the legal challenges that can be levied against councils who are proposing to cut library services.
This episode is brought to you by the Head of CILIP's, Sean McNamara, CILIP's Digital Assistant, Leah Higgins, and me, CILIP's Membership Officer, Kirsten McQuarrie. So please listen to episode 1 to catch up if you haven't already. We're now going to carry on from where we left off, speaking to Laurie, Hayden and Mike.
It's probably essential now to share Mike's legal wisdom, as we asked him to outline the legal framework around library closures, and here's what he was able to tell us about that.
Yeah, I did, do quite a bit of research, and I looked at the Local Government Act, and there's even older legislation than, say, 1973 Local Government Scotland Act. There's legislation that goes back way beyond that requires local councils, local government, to ensure there's a proper library provision. The difficulty with that local government legislation is it's not specific enough to say, let's protect a library, let's say, in X community in Dundee, for example. Because what that legislation does is it creates this sort of general obligation on the local authority to make provision across their local government area for libraries. So you could probably see where I'm coming from here, that to use that to save one particular library that's facing closure is very, very, very difficult. But what was interesting is, and I should, I guess, make it quite clear that, people in local government, i.e. councillors, are elected and they have certain powers. And so ultimately, a council may decide to close a library or a number of libraries, and they have that democratic power. But what seems to be happening is that the law comes along and says, particularly in terms of the Equality Act 2010, that in order for you to go through that exercise, there's certain processes that you need to do. And for example, in terms of the public sector equality duty, which is section 149 of the Equality Act 2010, the public authority has to, for example, advance the equality of opportunity between persons with protected characteristics. So, for example, that's people in terms of in relation to age, somebody's, a particular sex, somebody's particular disability. So the idea is that in terms of that duty, the local authority has to consider, if it does decide to close the library, what will be the impact of that decision for people in the local community that have protected characteristics. As I say, for example, it may be younger people, it may be older people, it may be single mums, it may be families, it may be ultimately service users that have particular disabilities. So it's important to also note that under the Equality Act, there's also the Equality Act 2010 Specific Duties Scotland Regulations 2012. Now, they're quite important because what they do is they say that where you have a listed authority, and that includes a local government, then they need to, in making their impact assessment, so an equality impact assessment on what would closure mean to local people with protected characteristics, they have to consider the relevant evidence relating to those persons. So what does that mean? Well, in my view, and certainly there's been a number of cases decided in Scotland's Supreme Court, that means you actually have to speak to people who have, for example, disabilities, who are service users that may be, for example, younger, they may be families. You need to engage with people. So there's an element of consultation that has to take place. And I think what we've discovered, certainly through last year and indeed this year, is that many councils in Scotland are just simply steamrolling ahead and deciding to close public libraries without going through the due process of properly considering what this would mean to people, as I say, with protected characteristics, age, sex, gender, disability, race. And if they don't engage in that process properly, we can challenge them by saying, hang on a minute, you've not done a competent equality impact assessment, you've not consulted, you've not engaged with local people in the community to enable you to do that assessment properly. And the way to challenge that is ultimately by identifying a person who's got sufficient interest in terms of the impact on them, and we raise a petition for judicial review in the court session in Edinburgh.
Reacting to a statement made by Hayden earlier in the interview, I wondered if the campaigners felt that the local council hadn't quite expected this strong of a response to the library closures, as if they'd hoped the news would just fall through the cracks in an exercise of public ignorance. But we know this was far from the case. When I asked this, I could see Laurie vehemently nodding her head in agreement whilst Hayden began to answer my ponderings. Their responses, like so many of their answers, were powerful.
It's a really good question, and it's a hard one to answer because I think throughout almost the entirety of last year's campaign, the City Council were like a kind of monolith, silent, blank, nothing. The City Council, we spoke to councillors, but the City Council itself, there was no communication with the City Council directly, ever. We ended up later on in the story with some contact and conversation with library services from within the City Council. But the City Council itself, very difficult to say. I don't think they expected it. I think there was a considerable degree of complacency, to be honest with you, both in a political sense, but also it would seem in a bureaucratic sense, in that there'd been an awful lot of negligence when it came to the proper processes that should have preceded any possible closure of these public facilities. So I think complacency and inscrutability would be the things that I would use as words to describe what I understand the council's position to have been, but it was so hard to tell.
Even that is just quite telling, isn't it? The fact that you're still not even really quite sure. Laurie, I could see that you looked as if you were agreeing quite heavily with that question.
I feel that they were hoping for the apathy of the city that we would give up. Particularly like at the beginning, they denied our right to speak. Like the councillors voted, like they could have voted to allow us to speak, and eventually at one of the meetings we were very shocked when they allowed me to give a deputation when they made the decision in December, and we were fully expecting that they were going to deny it again and vote, and we were all really shocked when they all of a sudden said, like, yeah, we'll allow this person to make the deputation. But even that says a lot, and a lot of councillors were really shocked, and there was we had really good support as well from Aberdeen Trade Union Council, who've obviously been involved in campaigns like this over many decades and have seen it all, and they were gobsmacked as well. Like I remember getting sort of text being like, we can't believe, we've never really seen this before, where they've voted against even, because it's literally a deputation. For those who don't know, it's just you've got 10 minutes to make a sort of statement about anything that's being discussed in that council meeting, and then there's 10 minutes for the councillors to ask that person questions about what they've said. There is never going to be any harm in allowing the public to speak, and actually had that been allowed, I do wonder if we would have had to have taken legal action, or that some of the actions that the council ended up taking would have been done before we took legal action, because the threat of it would have been enough. But I think they kind of hoped that we wouldn't find Govan Law Centre, or
that silencing that Laurie's describing. I mean, it also took on kind of sensational aspects too that are probably worth recounting as a low light, where at a full meeting at the City Council, a number of the protesters in the public gallery, when when that decision was taken, that a deputation would not be allowed, and that no one from the Save Aberdeen Libraries campaigning group would be allowed to speak. We had come prepared and had brought zip face emoji face masks, which we pulled out and put in front of our faces. That was visible to the councillors and visible to the Lord Provost of the city. And following a lunchtime break, the Lord Provost began the next session with a warning to everyone in the public gallery that should there be a repetition of the silent protest, then campaigners would be ejected from the public gallery.
You might have heard Laurie in one of the previous clips explain how historical documents kept in the various library archives in Aberdeen became an integral part of the advocacy campaign in fighting the legitimacy of the closures, but one in which legal advice was needed in terms of filing a Freedom of Information Act. This idea of the campaigners bridging the gap and allowing the library to advocate for itself was massively powerful. We asked Hayden to share a bit more about this experience.
Yeah, I think, so the library that was closed, that was closest to me in terms of distance, just along the road from where I live, is Woodside Library. And as Laurie's mentioned, that was the oldest library in Aberdeen. It had its 140th anniversary whilst being closed in October of last year. And the fact that it was the oldest, I'm someone who does historical research. That's part of my day job. And so that for me was kind of interesting. I wanted to know more about the story of the origin of the library, how it had come about, but also because I'd been tipped off that there were certain protections that had been put in place around the original bequest of monies which had enabled Woodside Library to be built, and then protections around its purpose and future use. So I spent some time looking into all of the archival papers that are held by Aberdeen City Libraries. And a lot of this centred basically on a statement which had been put in place by Sir John Anderson, the original benefactor, with words to the effect, and I'm paraphrasing here, that the land on which the library had been built and the building built for the purposes of the library should only ever be used for that purpose into the future. And so in effect, he was a bit of a soothsayer and was already anticipating in 1883 that the kind of threat that emerged in 2023 would come to pass. Now, I guess the legal question that arguably still remains is whether those protections that originally Anderson put in place still have legal power in 2023 or 2024. In the decision that Aberdeen City Council took last December, there was a short statement in fairly anodyne language suggesting that the City Council was entirely satisfied that the historical conditions around Woodside Library did not prevent its closure. I guess an interesting little, possibly postscript to all of this, because the library has closed and is closed, is that I did submit a Freedom of Information request asking to see all of the legal advice that the City Council had received around that particular clause about the original terms and conditions for the library. That Freedom of Information request was rejected in January of this year, and I've asked for that decision to be reviewed, and I'm still awaiting an outcome on that review. I guess what's interesting about it in retrospect is that ultimately the City Council spent, I think it's £31,000 on legal fees. That was legal fees in effect to, I'll use the language here, to double down on a decision that it had originally taken. So it was £31,000 in effect to spent of public money from the public purse to close a library. Campaigners have asked to see that legal advice that informed their decision. Arguably that's public monies that we have contributed to, but we're being told that we're not allowed to see the legal advice. I don't think that's very fair, and that's something that I'll continue to pursue. But I guess to loop all the way back to your question, Leah, I think in some senses, searching into the historical origin stories of some of these libraries was a really good way to bring the story to the public's attention. That some of these buildings are very old buildings. They have fascinating stories, the origin stories of how they came to be part of the city and came to be part of its public facilities. I think that sometimes gave our campaign a real push and a real punch. And there's nothing better than an anniversary to really bring home the significance and the relevance of a library at the heart of a community. And so Woodside's 140th was really important in that regard.
On a slightly lighter note, we had seen across social media all the amazing amplification of the campaign, with so many friends of CILIP's coming to the front line in support of the protesters. We asked them who some of their celebrity supporters are.
Number one was Damien Barr, who I had the pleasure of meeting. I actually participated in a writing workshop he did many years ago at the Edinburgh Book Festival, and we've been kind of sort of Twitter and Instagram friends ever since. And I was aware that he'd campaigned for his hometown library in Uritt Hill in Lanarkshire. So I had reached out to him just for like, hi Damien, like this is going down in Aberdeen, don't know if you're aware, like what do you recommend? And he put me in touch. I think it was him that recommended I got in touch with CILIPs potentially as well. There's Maisie Chan and Sarah Sheridan was sharing lots for us, and Esther Wolfson. We had Kirsten Innes and Kerry Hudson, who wrote absolute kick-ass columns in the Press and Journal. They contacted us through Twitter and we were able to give them some of the research we did. We gave them access to a drive of all the research we'd collected from different people, so they could use that to inform their work for that column as well. We had, obviously, there was a lovely young library user in Ferryhill, Charlotte, who is a massive David Walliams fan, and David Walliams was doing a signing in Waterstones in Aberdeen, and so she took a handwritten letter and spoke to him, and his team shared some of the campaign, and she was able to share her story with a journalist who wrote for Herald Scotland as well.
Kathleen Jamie, Val McDermott, various other folk, I think, who were active on social media, did a really good job of continuing just to punt our story around and make sure that it never quite slipped off the front of people's attentions on social media. To be honest with you, we were quite small in number as a group, right? Save Aberdeen Libraries was not a cast list of hundreds. And so if people are thinking about campaigns in the future, it doesn't require huge numbers of people, but it just requires lots of people with plenty of energy and investment.
As we mentioned at the beginning, this podcast tells the story of the campaign and those involved as a shining example within the landscape of many library campaigning stars. But we hope you'll also look at it as a resource for communities who find themselves in the same shoes as Hayden and Laurie. We asked them what advice they give to fellow library lovers who find themselves in similar circumstances.
Don't let the buggers get you down. And don't believe half the words they tell you.
No, don't take anything at face value. Go and seek out the data and reach out to organisations like CILIPs, like the Scottish Library and Information Council, the Library Campaign down in England and Wales, because these people have done it and they are going to be able to connect you and point you in the direction of the information you need to get. Like one of the key things was asking for footfall numbers, and not just footfall and library research, but knowing what questions to ask. So like a really key thing on the reason that the council officers gave to the councillors of why it was fine that the libraries would close is they were like, oh well, everyone's visiting digitally, people aren't going to their libraries anymore, which wasn't true. because they were basing it all on overall numbers when they had reduced the opening hours quite severely of libraries. There was the libraries that were closing had changed hours, that they were open many more times than those that had higher footfall numbers. So you don't know when your library's open. Of course, it's going to affect how often you're going there. If you turn up thinking, well, it was always open on a Monday from 9 till 5, and you turn up on a Monday and it's like, oh, it's now open on a Tuesday instead now, you know. But also the definitions of what that data means. So a digital visit in Aberdeen, if someone leaves a comment on a library's Facebook account, that's counted as a digital visit to the library. And I can see Leah and Kirsten are both going like, making, for people in the podcast, they're making what faces? Asked that question in a deputation to a committee. The councillors asked, and they did not expect to get, I could tell from their faces, they did not expect that answer either. So I think when they were getting told like, oh, well, it's, 1 million a year digital visits versus, 700,000 physical in-person visits or whatever it was, it's not quite the same as, someone's gone on a library website and downloaded an audiobook or access press reader to, tagging their friend about an event thing, like, so that they, hear about a workshop or a Lego group that's going on at their local community library that they know their pal might be interested in. So yeah, that's really important. And again, it took a while to even get like basic information like that, and ask directly to the councils, because although there is a data bank that the Scottish Library and Information Council have, some of that data is older, depending on when councils last submitted it to them, and if they bothered to submit it when SLIC asked for it as well. And one of the really helpful things that we were able to calculate was looking at that data in context. So like me and someone else who are both sort of come from a sciencey background and a sort of data background, we calculated the visits per hour that the libraries were open each week, which was a much more indicative way of sort of showing like how much these libraries were wanted and used and accessed to in relation to how accessible they were, and find stories. Like, I wish if we could go back in hindsight, we would have been in those libraries while they were still open during those 3 weeks and trying to like get contacts of people that we could go back and see, because it made it, we didn't know where those people were, and some people we found or found us, or we found them like months after it was too late, that like could have been petitioners for the and wanted to be petitioners, but the deadline had passed and things like that. So that would have made life easier if we'd been able to sort of collect some of our own data and our own stories while the libraries were open, which is why it's so important that they do these kind of public consultations and assessments when the libraries are open, because trying to do them after they're shut, it's very difficult to find the people that are most affected.
My advice would be the only way to counter cuts to public services is to call for accountability, rather than to slide into apathy. And I think I can absolutely understand why many people's responses to the cuts that are being faced in local government across, well, all of Scotland and indeed the UK, is to shrug and say, well, there's nothing we can do about it. And I'll be quite honest and say perhaps that used to be my attitude. I've not had skin in this game as long as Laurie. I've been new to library campaigning and indeed campaigning for public services. But the last 12 months for me have been an absolute education in the necessity of calling for accountability in all decisions. And statistics are subject to interpretation, and we had people who are actually able to counter numbers with numbers and ask some really effective, awkward questions. So accountability must always win out over apathy.
We also took the opportunity to ask Mike what practical moves protesters and advocates can take when looking to support their local library facilities. From his legal standpoint, is there anything that communities can do in the first instance to gather momentum before approaching somewhere like Govan Law Centre?
I think a number of things really. The first thing is get organised. Ensure that local people that use the local public library, for example, form a group. Doesn't have to be anything particular, formal, but that people come together. And so, for example, we take the example of Aberdeen. That was the Save Aberdeen Library Campaign. So people can come together and form a campaigning group, to give a voice and to give a presence, and to say to local elected members and indeed, members of the Scottish Parliament, members of Parliament at Westminster too, we don't want you to close our library because, and then set out why it's important. What does the library mean to a particular local community? What would happen if it goes? Is there anywhere else that people can use? Is there difficulties in, for example, in commuting to the next nearest public library? Maybe there isn't one that's nearby. What does this mean in terms of accessibility? What about people that have got mobility problems, who might find it very difficult, to go to a library, several miles away from where they live? And put the arguments out there. I think the second thing I would suggest that would be good to do is do a little bit of research and ascertain whether the council has undertaken a proper equality impact assessment. And just to say in terms of that, the ones that we saw, for example, in Aberdeen, were like a desk-based tick box exercise that didn't involve any actual people. It was just somebody ticking a number of boxes and filling a form. That is not, I have to tell you, a competent, lawful equality impact assessment in terms of the 2010 Equality Act and indeed the 2012 regulations made thereunder. So don't just think if somebody waves a piece of paper at you, that's sufficient. So do a little bit of research, and ultimately, if the council do decide that they're going to close the library, and they have to be looking at proper mitigation, so what's going to be the alternatives, and they haven't done any of that, then feel free to get in touch with Govan Law Centre. And if we've got the capacity, we'll have a look, and we'll look at the evidence. And if we think there's evidence, then the next thing we need to do is to identify our client or clients, raise court proceedings in Edinburgh to challenge.
So from an advocacy perspective, is there anything that you've seen that's been particularly impactful with the cases that you've represented? Or is there anything that communities can do to kind of complement or amplify the legal work that you're doing?
Well, I think as we've discussed, I think it's so important for local people to, try and work with as many people as possible. Your neighbours, people down the street, get everybody involved, make it a diverse and inclusive campaign, because the more people that you have supporting, the more powerful it is. For example, I know that many local campaigns across Scotland have drawn up petitions. So, some councils in Scotland allow you to petition the council. So you can petition the council. Most councils will allow you to do what they call a deputation. So you can have, for example, if you form a campaign group to save a public library, then you may have one or two people from that group that can ask the council if they can give a presentation in front of all of the elected members to make the case in terms of why saving a local library is so important. That's a good thing to do. You could ultimately also petition the Scottish Parliament. There's a petitions committee in the Scottish Parliament. So I think just from the point of view of grassroots, people power, create a voice, get the local newspapers, the local media involved. For example, get onto social media, create a presence for your campaign, because ultimately what you're in the business of trying to do is influence elected members at the end of the day, if we're honest. And if you can win and save a library by influencing local elected members, then, job done. And there's only if you can't do that and there's nothing else left, you'd probably come to somebody like us.
And finally, with such an enriching experience behind them, we asked Hayden and Laurie what the future of the Save Aberdeen Libraries campaign would look like. And it's fair to say, you can stay tuned for big things coming from them.
We're hoping to put together what we're figuring as an A to Z toolkit for other campaigners and campaign groups who might find themselves in a comparable situation to our own, where what we can do is just hopefully in a nice, quick summary fashion provide little alphabetical entries on everything that you need to do to mount and run a creative and colourful and hopefully fairly effective campaign. And that would be a nice legacy coming out of our efforts last year, which ultimately were unsuccessful in the sense of we weren't able to save the libraries. But if the legacy of that is experience that we can share and disseminate, that would be great.
It's something that we're very aware that there's more cuts coming in the future, and so we want to prepare to make sure that no more library provisions close, and also to make sure that the mitigations that they said are in place to reduce the impact of the closures are actually in place. So for example, in Cornhill Library at the moment, that was the only place people in the community can get any digital access if they don't have it at home, and there's a lot of people in our community that don't have internet or digital access at home. We have 25% of all the sheltered housing in the entire city within our little community council boundary, which is a lot. And so we're like, well, where are the computers and the printers and the photocopiers going to be put that were in the used access in the library? You know, they promise that they're at the moment in Cornhill Primary School that they've created a room next door that is their library. Like, what does that mean for access for the children? Is there actually a school librarian there? What does a library mean as well? I think sometimes what's classed as a library is, oh, it's a room with books in it, and we know that that is not all a library is. Qualified librarians are an essential part of any library service. So that's an aspect. And personally for me, I don't want to say that this is Save Aberdeen Libraries' future necessarily, but I'm certainly looking into whether we need to have a campaign group that is for the whole of Scotland to help people have better access and better protections for our public libraries, because I don't think the laws we have currently are good enough. It's too vague and woolly, and I think it's only from cases going to court that there's sort of legal precedents being set, and it's far too easy for them to close libraries. Therefore, we need better legal protections, and I think Mike Dailly's probably shared something to that effect, knowing what he's written recently in the paper and things. So that's something that I really want to fight for, because I know how much I've benefited from a library coming from a working class background as someone who's currently, you know, a writer, although unpublished, and studying it through the UCLA Writers Programme, and somebody who has at times been in a really low income and not had internet in my house, and you know, gone through periods of unemployment and illness where the library's been kind of one of the few places that I've been able to go and be safe. And I know my partner feels the same way. He always says the library's the one place you can go where you can stay as long as you want and nobody asks you for any money.
And if that wasn't enough, Mike left us with a note of how campaigners and library advocates can get in touch and keep up to date with news from the Govan Law Centre.
Absolutely feel free to contact Govan Law Centre. As I say, we do have the facility to do strategic public interest litigation. We can only do so much, you know, because we're a finite resource. But we do believe, and certainly my board of, community trustees believe, it's so important to try and protect local community facilities, and in particular public libraries. Our contact number is 0800 043 0306. So that's 0800 043 0306. And our email address is m@govan, that's GOVANLC.com. And if you want to go onto our website, because we have got some updates in terms of the current cases that we're doing, that is to be found at Govan Law Centre, that's all one word, .org. And there you'll get updates on some of our current cases. So just in terms of public libraries, we have a petition for judicial review in the Court of Session challenging the reported closure of Balloch Library in Western Berkshire. We've also got a case in two petitions in the Court of Session. Curtin Library, it's a community centre and a public library in Dundee, and those cases are waiting to proceed.
Just before we ended our interview with Hayden and Laurie, we asked them for a final few reflections, which remain powerful sentiments of their experiences.
No, totally. Can I also add, thank you to CILIPS and SLIC and the Scottish Book Trust for all that you do, because you all gave us valuable information and help. It was absolutely invaluable to our campaign, especially at the beginning. The letter that we wrote to the council was based on a CILIPS template. We obviously tweaked it to give an Aberdeen context, but I know I wouldn't have been able to help draft that letter had it not been for the fact that most of it was drafted for me by whoever did that at CILIPS. I want to thank Hayden and other campaigners, because I was only able to campaign as much as I did because they helped me do it. Hayden physically pushed me in a wheelchair to get me into council chambers, because I couldn't go independently on my own. One of the things I'm very, very proud of our campaign is how inclusive our campaign was, because I ended up meeting more people from the disability community through our campaign, because we had a number of people with disabilities involved in our campaign, and people from all age brackets, from the very young Charlotte to older generations who are what's Twitter and what's Facebook and what's Instagram and how does that work. And the fact that we all came together, I think, is really important, is a really good way to do campaigning.
Pushing the wheelchair was no bother at all, Laurie. It was delivering 2,500 leaflets through post boxes in Woodside.
I know, I couldn't help with that.
That was the bigger effort.
I know, but it meant a lot to me.
And if we're talking about being taken out of the comfort zone, me leading a conga of protesters around the grounds of Woodside Library, not something I'd imagined I'd be doing 12 months ago. Let me put it that way. No. I'm not big on leading congas.
I think the anecdote of the conga line was a good way to round off the interview, whilst also really capturing the heart, enthusiasm and willingness to advocate in any way possible. How nice too that all involved with this campaign have a mutual love and history with the library as a place that has taken them to where they are now. Individuals who are able to advocate for the place which gave them the tools and education to do this in the first place. It's the most full circle image.
Yes, a massive thank you is in order to Laurie and Hayden for their contribution to the podcast. We saw on social media that they treated themselves to some very well-earned cookies afterwards. And we should also acknowledge the whole wonderful team who facilitated the Save Aberdeen Libraries campaign. We'd also, of course, like to extend the biggest thank you to Mike Dailly and the team at Govan Law Centre. They are wonderful and tireless library advocates each and every day.
We hope that these episodes have left you with a sense of optimism and empowered to become the best library advocates that you can. There are so many ways to get involved, and the reflections and learning outlined by the Save Aberdeen Library Group should hopefully give you a solid foundation to learn from.
We love hearing from our members, and this podcast platform was designed to share and facilitate a shared voice from the library and information community. In fact, it was the Save Aberdeen Library Campaigners who used the podcast submission form to submit this idea and put themselves forward. So we hope you'll do the same.
If you have any ideas for episodes, or would like to come and speak to something you're passionate about, or have a project that needs a platform, please submit your idea via the podcast submission form. That can be found under the resources section on the CILIP's website at www.cilips.org.uk.
And most importantly, don't forget to subscribe. We have so many podcast plans in the works. Don't miss out. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.